Good evening, I'm Josh, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Namba people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I'm standing today. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and I celebrate the diversity of First Nations people here and across New South Wales and across the country, and their ongoing culture and connection with the land and waters of this place. It's very special to be here. So I'm in the middle of the Red Centre. I'm near Burke. This is where I live and work at the moment, and it's a place of huge significance to First Nations people. This area features prominently in the Biami creation legends. The Namba people, as I mentioned just now, are generally considered to be the traditional custodians of this land. But actually there are 14 tribes of First Nations people living in this area with their own languages and cultures. And this land is at the intersection of 7 different First Nations countries. So very special place. Very happy to be here and great to be talking tonight on this topic. So despite the significance of where I am right now and the great connections I've formed and conversations I've had with local Indigenous people, the events and the processes I'll be talking about tonight actually relate to what I experienced on the northern beaches of Sydney, which is home for me. It's where I've lived for most of my life until I moved here. And it's an experience I had, a cultural tour with a local elder called Uncle Laurie Bimson. And he's a great man, great part of the local community in that part of the world. He believes himself to be a descendant of Guringai, the famous First Nations person who was the first Aboriginal Australian to circumnavigate Australia with Matthew Flinders, and a great local diplomat and negotiator in the Sydney area at the time of invasion and colonisation. And just signifies the connection which still exists among First Nations people from those, early days of first contact, as we call it, to now. So he, Uncle Laurie, does tours of the local area in northern Sydney, and tours which explain the history and the culture of First Nations people from that part of the world. So it's a very special thing. I was able, while working in the area at a high school, to go with the Indigenous Studies class on an excursion which consisted of a tour from Uncle Laurie. So it was amazing. We went to West Head, which is located just across the water from Palm Beach, near Mona Vale and Terry Hills. And so we had a busload of students. We went out there. Uncle Laurie met us there, and he's a traditional custodian of the land there. So he was showing us around and showing us many of the things that he knew about Indigenous culture. So we began by looking at some of the tools First Nations people have used historically, and weapons, hunting weapons. So he showed us spears, clubs, boomerangs, and it was extraordinary. Everyone got to hold them and experience the weight of them and how finely crafted they were. A lot of them he had made himself, just from wood, and then had carved it down into these extraordinary instruments that they are, and quite deadly. It demonstrated how you could, not a real animal, but demonstrated how you would spear a kangaroo or something else you were hunting, or fish. How you would use them for maximum effect and causing minimal pain to the animal. He explained how when an animal such as a kangaroo had been killed, they would use every part of it as a sign of respect for the creature. They would eat the meat, they would use the skin and the fur for clothing, they would use the bones for other tools. They'd use the entrails. Every part of it would be used, and this would be a sign of respect for the creature. He showed us as well how they would use the bark of trees to make canoes, how this could be carved out in like a single piece of wood, which would then be made waterproof through a process of burning it and then submerging it in water as a means of hardening the wood and making it resistant to water. And this could then be used to sail huge distances in. We know Aboriginal people would travel long distances in their canoes across different parts of the country, and he was telling us about that. It was intriguing, it really was. And at the conclusion of this part of the tour, we got to, everyone who was there, the students and staff such as myself, got the experience of being able to use boomerangs. He brought a large supply, Uncle Laurie, and we were able to go to a clearing in the wood at this part of West Head and yeah, give the boomerangs a throw. It was extraordinary. The measure of success would be whether or not the boomerang actually came back to you as it was supposed to. That was a good outcome. Or if it just disappeared into the bushes and you had to retrieve it, that was a sign you had a little bit of learning still to do. It's definitely not easy. There's definitely a knack to it, and he of course was like just amazing at it. It would go and come straight back with a huge amount of force. And yeah, great experience to be able to do that. And for the students who were there on the excursion, most of whom were white, and it was, you could tell, just an eye-opening experience for them. Not something that many of them in Sydney get to experience on a regular basis or get to know much about until these sort of occasions come along. So very special. After that part of the tour, we then went over to another part of West Head where we were able to see some rock art, some Aboriginal rock arts from long ago. It was extraordinary in that I had visited the area many times before. There's walking trails there and lookout points and that sort of thing. So it's local to me, to where I lived at the time. So I'd been there many times, but I'd never actually seen or noticed this rock art. It was not part of the main trail or anything like that. It was not like widely advertised among the signage and that kind of thing, although it should be. But yeah, Uncle Laurie led us down this other, more obscure path, which took us to this large piece of rock where these paintings were. And it was extraordinary. There were the handprints, there were the drawings of people and fish and other animals and that sort of thing. And perfectly preserved by the formation of the rock. So that was a great experience to see that as well. We then moved on. We got back in the bus and moved on to a different part of the area. We went further up the road, further inland, to a large area of rocks that were on the ground, just smooth, large areas of rock that replaced the softer soil. And again, it's an area I've passed many times when visiting the area. The area is a national park. Had never noticed until this day when it was shown to us by Uncle Laurie that there were a series of carvings in these rocks. There was very detailed carvings, very large, showing Aboriginal people living life as they did, and this is from thousands of years ago. They could be seen hunting. There was clear pictures of them carved into the rock, using spears, interacting with kangaroos. It was clearly showing Aboriginal women with children, that sort of thing, showing us how the families worked. There was a funny image of a man, and Uncle Laurie was like, "Hey, have a look at this fat fella," and it was this guy who was portrayed as being a lot larger than the others in the adjacent pictures. And this fat fella, as he called him, had like a giant fish inside of his belly, and the fish was segmented. It had been carved in such a way that you could see these lines on it. And Uncle Laurie said, "Look, this man has eaten this large fish and had it all for himself, which he should, as the drawing shows, have shared with his family. It could have provided food to more than just himself, but he's been greedy and he's eaten it all on his own. And the punishment for this is clear." And he pointed, and there was this illustration of a large club carved into the rock about to come down on this guy's head. Some of the some of the traditional justice about to be administered to punish him for his greed. So again, another insight into the culture, how it was, and how First Nations people did life, did justice, did hunting back pre-invasion, pre-1788. And that was extraordinary as well. You know, there were other carvings there which showed how people who were like non-binary or had male and female biology were treated as special in Aboriginal communities at the time. They were seen as being able to benefit from the wisdom and the company of both the men and women of the community, and this was a unique privilege. So in contrast to much of the discrimination which LGBT plus people have experienced in societies around the world in more modern times, First Nations people of this country had a special place for those people, which was extraordinary to learn about. We then moved from the area to some other parts of the place where there was an area once used as a special gathering point for men of the community, and not too far away was an area for women of the community from traditional practices. So we went, we divided the boys and girls, and we went to these areas, and it was, you could feel the power there. It's hard to explain why, looking at it from a sort of, I guess, postmodern, super logical perspective, but these areas had sacred significance at the time, and that was palpable when you were there. So that was really cool to experience. We, as I said, most of the students experiencing this were experiencing it for the first time. They had not experienced anything of this kind, most of them, before. There was a German exchange student there. There was some Italian exchange students there. And seeing their humility and how they were receiving this information was good as well. And I think it shows how most Australians, regardless of their backgrounds, or even most people who live here, regardless of where they come from in the world, do appreciate the rich Indigenous history of this country, especially when they're able to investigate it and see it up close. So it was a really cool experience, and very glad to have been part of it. Just going to check my notes because I wrote some things down to make sure I don't forget anything. This was, and Uncle Laurie was talking a lot more while we're going around about what life was like pre-invasion, how Indigenous people survived in what is often very inhospitable terrain. He explained about how backburning was something they did. They would, light torches and walk down a hill towards where the water was, and with the wind just in the right conditions and that sort of thing. And this would burn away trees and foliage so that when the hot times came, there would be no accidental bushfires that could potentially, wipe out people and dwelling places. So this was a great thing to see as well. The technology and the way of caring for the lands which these people developed was extraordinary to see. It was very real. It was very clear way they had of protecting this country. It's getting past the person there, right? Excuse the person driving by. Anyway, so this was extraordinary to see. It really, you realise how wrong the attitude that civilization, quote unquote, came from the West is. It's not true. There was a great civilization, great way of life here for thousands of years, way before white people arrived. So it was very special to see that. And it's, as a teacher, it's amazing to have these experiences too, to get inspiration for how you can continue this awareness and spread this awareness to the students in our classes and beyond. Thinking of activities that could derive from events like the excursion I've just described. I mean, history is my subject. I'm a history teacher. There's obviously so many parts of the history curriculum where Indigenous people are focused and featured. as a focus part of the sequence of learning. So there's, you know, building a better world, where we ask ourselves, what was the impact of mass migration and invasion and colonization? What was the impact had among First Nations people when white settlers and convicts arrived here? There's the Making a Nation unit, which looks at the history of this country as it becomes more modern and as government tries to legislate everything, including the rights of Indigenous people, or lack of rights, as it often was for many years. There's the Rights and Freedoms unit, which is a big favourite of mine, talking about everything from the freedom rides up to Kevin Rudd's apology and beyond into the modern day, closing the gap, all of these things. And how none of this is to be taken for granted. All of it has been hard fought for by Aboriginal people and people good enough and brave enough to support them. Very, very humbling thing to put it in that kind of perspective. So there's, yes, events like the one I've described, the excursion I've described, form a huge part of making those subjects more real. Like I said, especially for, you know, white students, urban backgrounds who maybe haven't been exposed to this history through their own families or traditions. This is a great way of learning about it, by going out there, meeting people who know the history, who are descended from the people who watched the tall ships come, to quote the song, is a powerful thing. So I would definitely incorporate that into our history lesson. I, you know, include the visuals, include the tools and weapons that were part of that story. Make it very tactile, make it very real, so it, you know, is accessible for all kinds of learners. It's a great thing. I enjoy it. So that would be good. I mean, if I move subjects into the area of food tech, there is, of course, a huge tradition of bush tucker. Not just the sort of very well-known ones like Johnny Cakes and whatever, which are often featured in events, contemporary events with First Nations people, but a long history of using berries, kangaroo meat, this sort of thing. There are Aboriginal people in the community who will do classes on this, or you can find information as a teacher on how to prepare meals and food from that tradition, from using those ingredients. It's a very again, immersive experience. Shows what it was like, what it feels like, tastes like, even, to be part of that culture and history. That's a big part of it. I would do, and a third activity for in school that I can connect to the experience I'm describing would be using Aboriginal art, of course, and being able to study it, have a go at it. There are, again, many experts in the community, First Nations people in the community, who will come to schools, I've seen this happen too, and do demonstrations of how Aboriginal art is done, the dot painting, etc. What the images mean, what they signify, what the positioning of people and animals in a picture will say about the story you're telling, that kind of thing. And students love this. It's a great, most students enjoy art, and the depth which comes from the Aboriginal connection to it is extraordinary. I would definitely capitalize on that. And those are just 3 examples of some sequences of learning I look forward to implementing in future. Forgive me as it gets dark. I realise it's an evening time. We've got a beautiful outback sunset. So I think I might just about have enough light left to finish. So, and all of what I described, of course, is just one example. So the excursion I did was in the second half of last year, in 2022, and it's just one example of ways we can connect with the First Nations culture and community around us. Something all of us should definitely be doing. There is a great, I feel, flourishing of Aboriginal culture happening in our society at the moment. I'll add some more details of that in the document attached to this. And I think the growing awareness of who was walking on this land way before people like myself were is a very positive thing in our community. I think it's making a difference in attitudes towards Aboriginal people. It's increasing acceptance, reducing racism, increasing equal opportunity, closing the gap. Anything we can do to help this process, to make it more comprehensive, make it more accessible to especially children of today, so that we can finally move on from many of the issues which have blighted our country in the past. Anything we can do to move in that right direction is good. So yeah, I mean, the experience I've described was a great eye-opening experience for me, which helped me shape my perception of how these things are, and it's given me a lot of insight into how better to teach on this area. I've given the three examples I mentioned, and I look forward to seeing what the future has in store as more and more people continue to support equality in this country and the recognition of First Nations people and their land rights, which is well deserved and part of our history. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it, and I thank you again. Good night.